Okay, hi, this is Shannon again, and this is week 2 for fossils. So we're going to start off by doing a little bit of review for the lesson from last time, and here we go. Okay. So last time we talked a little bit about fossilization and preservation, just like the processes. So why don't we just go ahead and do this. Cool. Here we go. Alright, so last week we talked about how there are two types of fossils. There are body fossils and trace fossils. Um, so the two different kinds are basically exactly what the names say they are. A body fossil is a body part of an ancient organism, such as a bone, shell, tooth, or plant leaf that gets left behind and fossilized. Whereas a trace fossil, it can be a trace left by an organism such as burrows, coprolites, which are fossilized feces, tracks, nests, or footprints. So these are the two types of fossils that we talked about. We also talked about how most fossils are formed when organisms are buried by sediment. So this seems pretty straightforward. Basically, when an organism is buried by sediment, the different layers compress on top of it, which causes it to harden and fossilize. So there are several different forms that body fossils and trace fossils can take. So let's see, we'll talk about those. The first kind is a mold. A mold is basically an imprint left from something that was buried. So what happens is the structure itself decays, but then the imprint or the mold is left in the sediment. And so then if you break the rock open, then you can see the mold that is left behind. Next thing is a cast. A cast is formed when sediment leaks into a mold and hardens it to form a copy of the original structure. So a mold is basically like the outline or the imprint left behind, whereas a cast is if you fill that in with sediment and it becomes hardened and fossilized. So the next type is mineralization. So mineralization occurs when minerals carried in water build up in the spaces of an organism and eventually become rock. So sometimes only part of the organism becomes mineralized, but other times the entire organism becomes completely replaced by minerals. And so that's where the name comes from. It's where, yeah, the organic material just turns into rock because of mineralization. And the other type that we talked about is an impression. So an impression is a print or a mark made when an organism's body has been compressed or flattened. So impressions are a little bit different because the record of soft structures can also be preserved. So an organism's skin or different parts of its body that get compressed against a piece of rock or something can leave behind an impression as well. And leaves are actually the most common fossils preserved as impressions. So yeah, we talked about that. Other thing we talked about is although most fossils are formed when organisms are buried by sediment, there are actually several different forms that they can. There are also different ways that they can be formed. So the first thing we talked about is freezing. So freezing is basically a type of preservation for when an organism falls into some sort of body of water or there's just a lot of moisture and the water freezes over rapidly and it leaves the organism completely frozen. And so this is actually a really cool type of preservation because the remains have preserved bone, skin, muscle, hair, even internal organs. We talked about how there's even cases where different preserved frozen organisms still have the remains of what they ate that have been perfectly preserved within their stomachs. So that's pretty cool. Other type of fossilization that can occur is polymerization, or amber as it's more commonly known as. It's basically the process by which tree sap is converted to fossil amber, and amber can occasionally trap insects or just different things which preserves their bodies pretty perfectly. So yeah, it's also another form of fossilization that is not sedimentation. Another type we talked about is asphalt or tar. So this is another way that an organism can be preserved if it becomes stuck in a tar pit. And so when stuck in the tar pit, the organism obviously dies right there, and it decays, and the asphalt preserves the hard parts of the organism, such as the teeth, bones, and the outer shells of insects. So it doesn't preserve the soft structures, but it preserves anything that is known as a hard structure. So yeah. Okay. So now we also did a little bit. We talked a little bit about how hard structures fossilize better than soft structures. And that seems also pretty straightforward. Basically, for hard structures, they preserve better because they aren't as vulnerable to abiotic and biotic factors. Whereas soft structures, they get destroyed by like physical and biological things just very easily, more easily than hard structures do. So that's why hard structures fossilize much better. The last thing we talked about was petrification and mummification. So last week there was a little bit of confusion about the difference between mineralization and petrification. So I'm just going to clarify that a little bit right now. Mineralization is the process of fossilization in which mineral deposits form internal casts of organisms. So like what we talked about, the minerals are carried by water and then they fill in the spaces between or within the organic tissue. And so yeah, this is how mineralization is formed. And it's actually the first step in petrification. So petrification is basically like mineralization forms, and then in petrification, the cellulose cell walls are also completely replaced by minerals. So in this case, we talked about how petrification, it usually occurs, or we talked about the example of petrified wood. And so in this case, mineralization occurs within the organic tissues of the piece of wood, and then petrification is when that final step when the cell walls are completely replaced by minerals as well. So they're not necessarily different ideas, they're just kind of like different steps in the process of fossilization. We also talked about mummification, which preserves life form with some tissue or skin intact. So specimens preserved this way are very fragile, as you can imagine, and it's kind of a rare form of fossilization, and oftentimes isn't really classified as fossilization because it's not quite the definition that we use, which, as you recall, it's a remain or trace of ancient life. So, I mean, in a sense, it is a remain or trace of ancient life, but it's not necessarily something that's been fossilized in the way that we would define fossilization. Okay, so that was basically last week, and this week we are going to be moving on to talk about, going back, a little bit more about preservation, but beyond just like different types of preservation, we're going to talk about like where preservation occurs and like what circumstances need to be in place in order for it to occur. So here we go. All right, so I have several different environments, and I just kind of wanted us to look at them and guess or just predict which ones are more likely for fossilization to occur. So we have the benthic ocean, lakes, rocky intertidal, and rainforests. So I don't know, you guys can just take a guess and think which one seems like the most likely for fossilization to occur, and then why don't we look and figure it out. Cool. So fossil environments, fossils form for the most part in bodies of water because that's where sedimentation occurs. So like we talked about, fossils are oftentimes buried under sediment. And also fossilization needs to occur where the dead organism won't be disturbed. So this is very important because even if you're in a body of water and there's a lot of layers of sediment being added, If the organism is disturbed and the fossil doesn't get to completely fossilize, or the fossil gets disturbed or broken up, then the fossil will not form and there's no way to discover it. So yeah, these are two very important things for fossil environments. So I don't know if you guys guessed correctly, but where fossils can form would be the first two that we looked at, which are the benthic ocean and lakes. So the ocean floor is referred to as the benthic zone of the ocean, and in the benthic zone closest to land, sediments that are brought from land by runoff enter the ocean and quickly cover the dead organisms. So in these situations, there isn't much disturbance going on, so the fossils are allowed to form, and also it's in a body of water, which allows different layers of sediment to cover the organism and allow the layers of sediment to compress and allow fossilization to occur. The next environment where fossils can form is in a lake environment. So if an organism dies in or next to a lake, it can end up at the bottom of the lake where sediments can cover them. So this is similar to the benthic ocean environment, where there's a body of water that allows continual deposits of sediment and the compression of these sediments on top of a dead organism. Also, rivers, swamps, deltas, and lagoons. These are also areas where water can bring sediments to cover dead organisms. So they're all pretty related, and these are the two different fossil environments that we're going to be looking at. Which leaves the next two that we talked about, which are environments where fossils cannot form. So these two are the rocky intertidal and the rainforest. So again, we talked about how fossils need to form near bodies of water, and both of these are near bodies of water, but they are missing that second crucial component, which is the fossil needs to be undisturbed. And so in the rocky intertidal, this is the area along the ocean shore where waves crash against rocks. So it's pretty obvious if there's waves crashing against rocks, there is a lot of disturbance. And so maybe there is a lot of sediment being brought in, sorry, but the fossil cannot form because it's constantly being disturbed and broken up. So yeah, it says here it's difficult for fossilization to occur because most organisms that die here are broken up by waves and carried away before they can be buried. The next one is the rainforest. And so I guess when you think about it at first, the rainforest seems like it should be a pretty stable environment where there isn't much disturbance. But actually, there is a large amount of rain throughout the year, as you can imagine, and this causes rapid decay of organisms. The organism isn't allowed to just sit and decay buried under sediment, but all the rain washes through year after year. There's also many scavengers and decomposers that work quickly to break down the tissues and the structures of rainforest life. And so, as you can see, we have these abiotic factors and biotic factors working to break down the material of the organism left behind, and so the organism just is not allowed to fossilize. So this is why rainforests are not typically good fossilization environments. Cool. So the next topic we're talking about is how the fossil record is incomplete. Yeah, so basically organisms, they live and die in different environments. We know that. However, only some of the remains of organisms that die resist destruction from environmental and biological factors. So we kind of talked about that with the 4 different fossil environments. And within those that remain, only a few will resist destruction long enough to become fossils. So even in the environments of the benthic zone and lakes and different regions like water, like rivers and lagoons and things like that, just because it's a good fossil environment doesn't mean the fossil actually forms. And so with that, there's a bunch of diverse, different types of organisms, different ecosystems, but within those, only a very few amount of the organisms that lived in those places will become fossilized and be part of the fossil record. And so paleontologists actually estimate that less than 10% of all the organisms alive today will become fossilized. This is because not all types of organisms preserve well. So an example is, well, insects make up a very large percentage of all animals, but very few of them are likely to be preserved as fossils. mostly because they are invertebrates, or most of them are, and there's only a few fossilization um, processes that allow invertebrates to be preserved. Whereas organisms like vertebrates, they will leave a more complete record of their existence, even though they are less abundant. So, I mean, you can see this even in pop culture. When people think of fossils, they think of like bones of dead animals or dinosaurs or different vertebrates of the past. No one really, like, most people don't think like, wow, there were so many insects in the past. Can't wait to see them in the fossil record. And this is just because, well, insects don't preserve very well. And so when we think of the fossil record, there's just a greater percentage of it that records the vertebrates that were alive in the past. So paleontologists keep this in mind when interpreting fossil evidence so that they can get a more accurate picture of life in the past. Otherwise, people are going to look back and study what the fossils tell us about the past, and they're going to infer that the world was inhabited solely by dinosaurs and like there were no other life forms, which is definitely false. So this is just something they keep in mind. Another thing is that even after a fossil is formed, it can easily be destroyed. Kind of like what I was talking about before, just because a fossil is formed doesn't mean that it stays preserved to be discovered. So since the Earth is very dynamic, let's look at some different ways that fossils can get destroyed. So the first one is if a fossil is crushed. So basically, a fossil is formed when it's buried under layers of sediment. But if a fossil is buried by too much sediment, it can become flattened or distorted beyond recognition, which destroys the fossil and makes it difficult for paleontologists to infer anything from it. Another way that fossils can get destroyed is by being melted. So once a fossil is buried in sedimentary rock, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe. Eventually that rock might be buried very deeply and undergo extreme pressure and heat. So it becomes metamorphic rock. And then the rock itself changes and any fossils within it are probably melted. And in that, the fossil is destroyed. Other ways that fossils can be destroyed are if they're moved. So once fossils are formed, they can be washed away by streams, moved by glaciers, carried by scavengers, caught in rock slides. Also, there is the topic of plate tectonics, which can shift the different continental and oceanic plates around, which can cause fossils that may have once been part of the ocean floor to be found at the top of a mountain after millions of years. And this is a process called uplift, and this can also destroy or distort different fossils. The last form is by erosion. So weathering by wind, water, and sun can destroy a fossil by wearing it away. This seems pretty straightforward, but here are some pictures to kind of help you visualize what I was talking about. So in the top left, that's a fossil that has been crushed beneath just too much sediment, and it's now unrecognizable. On the top right, this is the process of metamorphosis. And so sediments are formed, and then the sedimentary rock may have fossils within it, but then it undergoes extreme heat and pressure, which turns it into a metamorphic rock, and then it can melt, and then the fossil is destroyed. Bottom left is what I was talking about fossils being moved. So you can see there's a stream in the middle that's carving through this canyon and just taking fossils along with it. There's also possibly a little bit of geologic uplift where the plates shifted, moving around the layers a little bit and destroying the fossils. The bottom right is a fossil that has been eroded. So it's actually a turtle shell, or it used to be a turtle shell, but as you can see, the bottom chunk of it, mostly on the bottom left, has been destroyed due to erosion. It could have been wind, it could have been water, it could have been sun, but basically the fossil is now destroyed and damaged. So yeah, these are 4 different processes that could affect whether a fossil is preserved and left to be discovered. So another thing is, before a paleontologist can identify and study fossils, they have to find them. So I feel like that's straightforward too. But if an organism becomes a fossil, and if the fossil survives Earth's forces, then it has a chance of being found. However, only specific types of rock are likely to contain fossils. And so paleontologists begin their search by finding areas that have the right rock type. And so I feel like this is pretty obvious, but what is this rock type? It's sedimentary rock. Yeah, good job. And so we've talked about that before. So why do you think it is that sedimentary rock is the rock type that fossils are more likely to be formed in? Okay, yeah, it's basically what we've been saying before. So sedimentary rocks are made up of layers of small particles, sediment, which are compressed and cemented together. And so in that, different layers of sediment form, which allows the fossils to harden and undergo whichever processes they need to undergo. And then there you have it, it's preserved. So yeah, sedimentary rock is the rock type where fossils are generally found. But what are the other two types of rock, and why don't they contain fossils? Okay, so we will take a look at that. So the other two types are igneous and metamorphic. We talked about metamorphic a little bit earlier. But igneous rocks are produced when molten magma or lava cools and solidifies. And so it seems pretty straightforward, but these extreme temperatures, they would destroy any organism caught in the lava flow. So this is magma is at a temperature hot enough to melt bone and teeth and any structure that would have been preserved to be discovered in the fossil record. And so, yeah, these are just not ideal conditions for discovering fossils because no fossils are going to be formed in them. The other type of rock is metamorphic. And so these are any type of rocks that are changed by heat, pressure, and chemical activity. So most fossils are destroyed when their surrounding rock is transformed into metamorphic rock, just because it, as the rock is transformed and pressured and just distorted, so is the fossil. And so the fossil does not remain after rocks undergo this process. So yeah, so those are the two different types, and these are just really not ideal conditions for discovering fossils, so scientists or paleontologists typically direct their search to areas where there's lots of sedimentary rock. So here are some different common sedimentary rock fossils, or these are common sedimentary rocks that fossils can be found in. So the first type that we'll look at would be sandstones or siltstones. So these are usually found in offshore deposits or beaches, and they commonly preserve water ripples, tracks, petrified wood, dinosaur bones, and hard-shelled invertebrates. So these are pretty common. We'll take a look at some of them in just a second. And the next one is a conglomerate. So conglomerates can contain fossilized bone and teeth, as well as amphibian and reptile fossils. So just kind of a definition of conglomerate, because I know it might not be a very common word, but I guess in just regular diction, a conglomerate is a bunch of different things like grouped together, right? Whereas in geology, a conglomerate is a coarse-grained sedimentary rock composed of round fragments with a matrix of finer-grained material. So that may sound a little complicated, but it's basically like a bunch of larger pieces of rock that are kind of held together or cemented together by like smaller, finer-grained sediment. That's basically what it is. So why don't we look at some examples of both of these. So the pictures on the left are sandstone and siltstone. So top is bones, bottom is different tracks. And on the right, it's a conglomerate. So these are fossilized remains of shells that are preserved in this kind of like conglomerate rock where there's just bigger pieces that are held together by smaller, like finer grains. That's basically all it is. So next we also have shale. So shale is probably the most common fossil preserving rock, and it can contain fossils that are perfectly preserved, containing vertebrates, invertebrates, or plants. There's also limestone, which is another common fossil preserving rock. It represents both shallow and deep tropical seas, and it can contain invertebrate fossils as well as remains of armored fish and shark teeth. Last one would be coal or coal shales. So these can contain plants, fish, insects, marine invertebrates, and even dinosaur footprints. So here are some pictures of the ones that we just talked about. The one on the left is shale. As you can see, it preserves the organism really well, which is why you can have some perfectly preserved organisms found in shale. The top right is limestone, that's a trilobite, and the bottom left is coal, or coal shale. So yeah, that's all that we have on preservation for this week, and we're going to be moving on to our next topic. But does anyone have any questions? Should I go over anything again? Okay, if not, then I'm just going to keep going. So at the end of this session, we'll review a little bit, but hopefully that wasn't too fast for everyone. So here we go. Now we're going to move on to relative and absolute dating. So like we talked about earlier, I mean, fossils or the fossil record is important because it helps paleontologists understand different life forms and what the Earth was like in the past. And so one way that fossils can be used to do that is to give us an accurate understanding of the way time was broken up in the past, or the different geologic time zones that we've had. And we'll get to that for our next session. But basically that's what the point of relative and absolute dating is for. It's so that you can understand when the fossils were formed in order to better understand that time period and the life forms that were alive during that time. So let's jump in. Alright, so relative dating. So I included this slide because I wanted something a little bit funny. And basically, disclaimer, relative dating is not dating your relative. I found this graphic on this one website, and I thought it was kind of funny. So basically on the left, there's like the relative dating that we're talking about, and then on the right, there's the relative dating that is illegal in the state of California. So let's move on to actual relative dating that we're talking about. So basically, relative dating orders events in chronological order. So it can tell you which events came first, but it doesn't tell you the exact date of which it occurred. So I have like a little picture here to kind of illustrate that. So as you can see over here, this layer of rock is older than this layer of rock over here. And also this layer of rock over here is older than this layer of rock over here, or this fragment that kind of cuts through. And you might be wondering, well, how do you know that? That's a good question, and we're going to address that right now. So here we go. So there are several relative dating principles that help us to understand how to date these different layers of rock. So the first one is the principle of superposition. It's probably the most straightforward one. Basically, if you have undisturbed layers of sedimentary rocks, then the layers will be younger as they near the top. So basically, the oldest layers are on the bottom and the youngest layers are on the top. If we go back to what we saw earlier, this checks out because the oldest layer is at the bottom over here, and then it just gets younger and younger as you go up. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. The next one is the principle of lateral continuity. So the picture that I showed you earlier does not demonstrate this very well, but basically horizontal strata, or layers of rock, extend laterally until they thin out to zero thickness, or the term is pinch out, at the end of their basin of deposition. So basically, this might sound a little bit confusing, but it's just saying that like you're not going to have a layer of rock that's like 20 feet thick in one place and then just like suddenly cut off, and like that layer of rock is just that little area of 20 feet thick rock. Basically, each layer of rock extends horizontally and just like covers the entire area of which this sediment was deposited. So it's not just, so basically it's saying that like the outer edges are going to be thinner than the inner layer because of how the horizontal strata extends laterally, and then it thins out to zero thickness. Hopefully that was kind of clear. I don't know if I explained it super well, but if you have any questions, just type them in and I'll address them. Next one. So the next principle is the principle of original horizontality. So it's basically just saying that rocks are originally layered horizontally, And if you have layers that are higher on one side than the other, it's just due to the tilting of rocks that are caused by a geological event. So if the layer is like a little bit slanted and not perfectly horizontal, it's originally it was layered horizontally. It's not that one like area of it was just layered way more thickly and the other one only got a thin little layer. It's just that the tilting of the rocks were caused by some geological event, probably either uplift, which we talked about, or an earthquake or something. So yeah, that's the third one. The next one is the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So this refers to that part of the picture that we looked at earlier where there's just a fracture or cut in a rock that's caused by another rock. And that fracture or cut in a rock is always younger than the rock that it cuts. And I think on first thought it might seem a little confusing because like this layer of rock just like cuts in and obviously gets farther down and goes deeper than the top layer of rock. But in order for this rock to have cut through all these layers, it has to have cut through the top layer too, which makes it the youngest one. Hopefully that made sense. Let's just go back and look at it one more time. So if we look at this picture, this layer of rock formed first, and then there's this layer, and then this layer, and then this layer, and then after all these layers were formed, this last fracture just kind of cut in, which makes it the youngest one because all these other layers had to have formed first. Hopefully that made sense. And we'll get to our last principle. It's the principle of inclusion. So fragments of one rock in another rock must be older than the rock it is contained in. Simply put, it's just if you have a piece of rock and it's encased in another rock, the rock that's in the middle is older because it had to have formed first in order for the other layer to have formed around it. So that's all that is. So these are the 5 principles that help us with relative dating. Hopefully you guys are good. Do you have any questions? Okay, well, I just wanted us to take a little bit of time to kind of put this into practice. So I have this little picture, and we're going to talk about, we're just going to try to date these relatively. So you don't have to like write it down or anything. We'll just do it verbally, and hopefully this will help you guys. So in this, based off of the different principles that we talked about, let's see. So I is obviously older than H due to the last principle we just talked about, which is the principle of inclusions, right? So hopefully that is not super confusing. It's just that I is contained within H, therefore it is older. And the same goes for H is older than G because it's contained within G and had to have formed first. So yeah, principle of inclusion. So that was pretty good. Other things we can look at. So you can see that E and F are slanted a little bit. They're not like perfectly horizontal, and that is related to the principle of original horizontality. When they were formed, they were horizontal, but at some point a geological event just kind of caused them to tilt a little bit. Other things we can talk about. So J is going to be younger than E, F, G, H, and I because, J is going to be younger than E, F, and G. We can't say clearly for H and I, but probably because H is older than G. But anyway, so it's younger because of the principle of cross-cutting relationships, where it just kind of cuts through all these layers of rock, meaning that it was formed later in order to have been able to cut through these. What's the other things we can look at? Well, let's see. So the principle of lateral continuity, that could be applied to layers I and H. So basically these layers, they extend until they just kind of taper out and, the term is pinch out. So they pinch out to 0 thickness. So as you can see for I, it's obviously pretty thick in the middle, but on the edges, it just kind of thins out until it has 0 thickness. And so this applies the principle of lateral continuity applies. Last thing is the much more straightforward one, which is the principle of superposition. So from all this, you can see, like, obviously C is older than A, D is older than C. You can go like lower, F is older than E, so on and so on. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully it wasn't that confusing. Yeah, if you want, you can take a picture of this, and then just later on when you guys have time, you can try to figure out which one is which and which one is older or whatever relative to the other layers by yourself if you want more practice. So yeah, go ahead and take a picture. I'm going to switch the slide now. Alright, cool. So now we're going to talk about absolute dating. So absolute dating is similar to relative dating in that they both order events in chronological order. However, unlike relative dating, absolute dating can determine the ages of rocks. So here in this picture that I've included, you can see on the left for relative dating, it just kind of gives you an approximate, like, this one's the youngest and this one's the oldest, whereas for absolute dating, it can give you the exact age. So this youngest on the relative dating side is approximately 115 to 125 million years old. And for the oldest down here, this piece of rock, or this layer of rock, is approximately 130 to 150 million years old. And so with absolute dating, we can get a much more precise date on these rocks. Okay. So now we're going to be talking about absolute dating methods. And so one method that we are definitely going to be talking about is radiometric dating, or also known as radioactive dating. And this is a technique used to date materials such as rocks or carbon in which trace radioactive impurities were selectively incorporated when they form. So that sounds a little complicated, but basically this method just compares the abundance of a naturally occurring radioactive isotope within the material and the abundance of its decay products, which form at a known constant rate of decay. And with this comparison, scientists can approximate exactly how old this product is, or this organism or rock is. So to paint kind of a fuller picture, just to give you some background information, an isotope is a variant of a particular chemical element which differs in neutron number, although all isotopes of a given element have the same number of protons in each atom. And so the form that, or kind of like a more inclusive description of how radioactive decay occurs is, so basically a collection of atoms of a radioactive nuclide or an isotope decays exponentially at a rate described as a half-life. And so after one half-life has elapsed, one half of the atoms of the isotope will have decayed into a daughter nuclide or a decay product. And so with this, you can compare the amount of the daughter product with the amount of the original product, and if you know the half-life of the isotope, then you can use this to calculate exactly how old this is. So hopefully that made sense. If you guys have any questions, just stop me and we'll go a little bit slower, but hopefully that was okay. And so yeah, like I said, as time goes on, the amount of parent material in a rock decreases as the amount of daughter product in the rock increases. And so geologists can determine the age of the rocks by measuring the amount of parent and daughter material in the rock and knowing the half-life of the parent rock. So that's basically a good summary of what I just said. And here's like a little graph, hopefully helps a little. So at the beginning, there's obviously only parent isotope and no daughter isotope. And then after one half-life, there's exactly half. And then after another half-life, there's half of that half, and it continues. So here is a fuller description of a half-life. So the half-life of an isotope is how much time it takes for half the atoms in that isotope to decay. And after that many years, half the atoms in the isotope will decay. And then after that many years again, half of that half, so 1/4 of the whole, or 2 half-lives will decay. And after that many years again, half of that half 1/8 of the whole, or 3 half-lives, will decay. And it will go on until the isotope decays to its daughter product completely. So did that make sense? Was that okay for everybody? Just basically describing what a half-life is. Okay, I'll just continue. So one example of radiometric dating that is widely used is carbon dating. So we're going to use this as like an example to help us more fully understand radiometric dating. So for carbon, as soon as a living organism dies, it stops taking in new carbon. And so the ratio of carbon-12, which is regular carbon, to carbon-14, which is the radioactive isotope at the moment of death, is the same as every other living thing, but the carbon-14 decays and is not replaced. So carbon-14 in this case would be the parent material that decays. And so carbon-14 decays with its half-life of 5,730 years, while the amount of carbon-12 remains constant in the sample. And if you look at the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the sample and compare it to the ratio in a living organism, it's possible to determine the age of a formerly living thing fairly precisely. So hopefully that kind of made sense. So with the half-life of 5,730 years, and as the carbon-14 continues to decay, you can compare it to different living organisms and just approximate how, or the age of a formerly living thing. And so, yeah, this is a commonly used form of radiometric dating. And however, because the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, it's only reliable for dating objects up to about 60,000 years old. So this is not the form used to determine how old a dinosaur was, or different fossils that came from beyond 60,000 years ago. But yeah, this principle still applies to other isotopes, and people use other isotopes that are radioactive in order to determine the ages of dinosaurs. So yes, hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Here's a little graphic to kind of help you guys visualize it a little better. And so this is like a buried piece of wood. At the beginning, it's at 100% of like carbon-14, or like how much it's supposed to have. And then after its half-life, it is only at 50%. And after another half-life, it's at 25%. And then another half-life is at 12.5%. This continues on and on and on until, until the carbon-14 is completely gone and completely replaced by its daughter product. So, yeah, again, if that was confusing at all, just let me know. We can go back. We'll review it in just a little bit because we're nearing the end of our session. But hopefully that was okay. I'm going to be moving on. So this is, basically we're done with new information. I just want us to go back and go over what we learned so that it's not just like we hear it once and it goes out the other ear. So let's talk about this. So we started off by saying fossilization occurs in or near bodies of water because that is where sedimentation occurs, and it occurs where the dead organism won't be disturbed. So some environment examples would be the benthic ocean and lakes. And remember, the other two environments that are not conducive to fossilization would be the rainforest and the rocky intertide. So cool. Next thing is the fossil record is incomplete because not all organisms preserve well. And even after a fossil is formed, it can easily be destroyed. So it can be crushed, melted, moved, or eroded. And we talked about those 4 different processes, and hopefully you remember what each one is like. So keep going. So fossils can only be found in sedimentary rock, as opposed to igneous and metamorphic, and we also talked about why. So some different types are sandstone and siltstone, conglomerates, shale, limestone, and coal shale. So I included the extra information for that slide earlier, not because you have to memorize it, but just to kind of give you an example or an idea of what these different sedimentary rock fossils would look like. So you don't have to memorize that. I just want you to be familiar with these different types, and hopefully if you can like remember the different types, then it'll kind of call to mind like, oh, well, this type of rock generally has this type of fossil, so, or this type of organism. So yeah, just more information for you guys. It's not needed to be memorized. Okay, and then after this, we moved on to relative and absolute dating. So relative dating tells you the chronological order of events that occurred, but not the precise date. So we talked about the principle of superposition, which is basically oldest on the bottom, youngest on the top. Principle of lateral continuity, so rock layers, they extend across the entire area until it kind of pinches out at the end and it has zero thickness. Principle of original horizontality, everything was originally formed horizontally, but sometimes there's geological events that cause shifting or tilting. Principle of cross-cutting relationships, so a fracture or a cut into rock is always the youngest. And principle of inclusion, which is that a rock that is included or encapsulated within another layer of rock is the oldest one, or older than the other outside layer. So yeah, that's relative dating. And lastly, we talked about absolute dating, which can determine the actual age of rocks, and talked about radiometric dating, half-life, and carbon dating. I feel like that'll be difficult for me to try to summarize again in 2 minutes, but does anyone just have any issues or questions with that? I understand that this idea of like radiometric dating is slightly more complex, so it's okay if you don't completely understand it. You don't have to memorize the exact steps or processes, but just kind of understand the general way that it works and how scientists use it to determine age. So yeah, hopefully you guys have any questions? Okay. So I guess my only thing is that I want you guys to continue to be reviewing this and getting familiar with these different topics that we cover. I'm not going to assign homework or anything. I'm just going to encourage you guys to maybe review your notes or look over slides again or something and just continue to just get this information drilled into your brain so that it's not something that you have to like cram and study for the night before you actually compete. So yeah, next week we're going to be talking about something I mentioned earlier, the geologic timescale, and also we're going to talk about index fossils and how index fossils help us to understand the geologic timescale better. And that's basically it. Again, let me know if you have any questions. You can just, you can send your questions to Top Kids and they'll get them to me. Hopefully this was helpful. Just like last week when one student had a question about mineralization and petrification, I wasn't able to answer it on the spot, but if you have a question for me, I'll look it up and hopefully I'll be able to address it in our next class. So yeah, thanks guys. I will see you soon.